Hello, everyone. I am recording this astronomy segment a day early because there's some astronomy news sort of hot off the press in which I was involved. Some of you might have known that there was a big press conference this morning. In fact, there were 6 press conferences spread around the world releasing the results of many years of work by a group of astronomers, a very large international team, in which we actually created and presented the first ever actual image of a black hole. Anything you've seen up till now has been a simulation or an artist's conception of a black hole, one or the other. But this is actually an image made with a very special kind of telescope called the Event Horizon Telescope. And I was lucky enough to be in on this on the ground floor because the original instrumentation for it was developed at Haystack Observatory, which is where I worked. And the driving force, I guess, behind the Event Horizon Telescope was a guy named Shep Dolman, who is currently the EHT director at Smithsonian. But for many years, he had the office across from mine at Haystack, and so I got to work quite closely in a number of areas in the program. So black holes, most of you are aware, are the very concentrated regions of mass that result when either a star implodes because it has too much mass, or you can have multiple stars or black holes coming together and forming very large black holes. And the nearest of these that we know about are remnants of stars that are a few thousand light years away. They're pretty far, and their diameter is quite small as well. They're only a few kilometers in diameter, which means that they appear very small as an angular size in the sky, too small to observe. But the largest of the apparent sizes of black holes is actually the black hole at the center of our galaxy, called Sag star. And that's farther still. That's 23,000 light years or so to the center of our galaxy. But that black hole is a so-called supermassive black hole. It's about 4 million times the mass of our sun. And as a result, it's a couple of times the physical size of our sun. That is, the black hole itself is larger than our sun is. And so at that distance and at that size, it's still very small, but it's with a lot of work and cleverness, you can just barely see it from the Earth. This particular image, though, that was presented today was one of a different black hole called M87, which is almost as large in the sky, almost appears as large as Sag star, is the one in our Milky Way. But it's much farther away. It's, in fact, about 55 million light years away in the Virgo cluster of galaxies. And M87 is a supergiant elliptical galaxy. And the black hole that is in the center of it is 6 billion times the mass of our sun. 6 billion with a B, which is just about the mass of our whole galaxy concentrated into that black hole. And as a result, it's much larger than the black hole in the center of our galaxy, and it appears in the sky to be almost the same diameter. But still, to see it, it's a very small thing. We need a telescope with extreme resolving power. We need more than 1,000 times resolving power than the Hubble Space Telescope is capable of, and that's why the EHT was formed. The EHT is a group of telescopes, currently about 8 in number, spread around the world, all looking at the same direction and at the same frequency at a particular time, using a technique called very long baseline interferometry. And when you do that, you are able to synthesize a telescope mirror nearly the size of the Earth. And in order to actually get the resolving power, not only do you need this big dish that's almost the size of the Earth, but you have to look at very high frequencies as well. So we're up at a couple of hundred gigahertz, or wavelengths of about a millimeter or so, which is sort of extreme by radio astronomy standards. So the signals that are received at each of these antennas and converted, they're very accurately time-stamped with hydrogen masers, and recorded at a 32 gigabit per second rate to high-capacity digital recording systems that I wrote the software for. And that data is then flown back. It's on a whole lot of 8 terabyte disk drives. It's actually about 5 petabytes of data, which, if a petabyte is 1,000 terabytes, so 5 petabytes is 5 million gigabytes, enormous amount of data. So it was flown back and processed, combined in a special kind of processor at Haystack Observatory and a similar one at Max Planck Institute for Radio Astronomy in Bonn, in a processor called a digital correlator. And after correlating the data and doing some various stages of post-processing and image formation, we were able to form this image. And it is just a single image for a whole lot of data, but it's something that we just couldn't have seen any other way. The bright areas that you're looking at are due to an accretion disk of very hot matter, or rapidly rotating near the speed of light around the black hole. And as it spirals in, it heats up. And the light that you're seeing is actually the disk from behind the black hole that is bent around the black hole, with the black hole acting as kind of a gravitational lens to focus it and send it in our direction. And the black area you see in the center is the black hole itself, and going out to the event horizon at the edge. So it's a little blurry, but it's a fascinating result. It shows that black holes really look like what we think they look like. It's oddly enough, it looks surprisingly much like the simulations. But this is real, although I'm sure there'll be people who doubt it and think that there's they don't think we landed on the moon. They probably don't think we have pictures of these black holes either. But this is a very small, a large object, but so incredibly far away that looks small in the sky. And actually, I did a calculation. The size of the black hole, people do various analogies, but it's the same size as a donut would look like held by somebody standing on the limb of the moon. So if there were somebody there on the moon and they were eating a donut and held it up, that's about how big this bright area around the shadow of the black hole is. So that's quite a technical tour de force, and it was pretty exciting to hear the press conference this morning. I was invited down there, but I didn't go because there's a reception tonight at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and that would have been fun to go to too. But it's tonight is chess club, and I've been gone on vacation the last couple of weeks. I didn't want to miss one more game, so I hope it's worth it. So I'll wind this up and now let you get on to some chess. Well, welcome to the chess portion. Today is tomorrow or some such nonsense. And I dodged just barely a bullet last night. And it was an exciting rough and tumble game. And a bit long to go through explaining every single move. So I'll try to just go briefly through many of the moves and just stop at the high points if I can. But I ended up playing Mike Meehan, who's rated about 400 points below me. And it was a game I really couldn't afford to lose. But he's a B player. He's not easy to beat, and in this game he definitely outplayed me for much, if not most, of the game. And so he opened up with D4, and it looked like it was going to be a collie system. But then it looks maybe more like a Stonewall, with bishop to D3. The Stonewall is very popular, or Stonewall London system is very popular these days. Except that it doesn't have the bishop on F4, I realize, so it really wouldn't have been a London system. So I went with sort of an Indian setup against it, and since he wasn't occupying the center, I decided to attack aggressively there, as I normally do. And he continued to develop, and finally shows that what he's really interested in is the Stonewall Attack, where white sets up very solid pawn chain here in the dark squares, develops his pieces as he's going to with his knights on F3 and D2 and his bishop on D3, and is going to attack on the king side. And this only became clear slowly, at least slowly to me, as we were playing along. And at each step of the way, I had to try to figure out what his intent was and how best to counter it. Figure out the optimal setup for my pieces to counteract wherever he's heading. I knew this knight was coming into e5, and there wasn't really a lot I could do about it. So I decided to go ahead and try to play around that knight, leave it on e5, and just, make sure I don't allow any tactics that arise out of it. But of course, it's a dangerous strategy. What I really had hoped to do was to maybe get my knight into e4 to counteract his knight. So that would be a nice thing, and that was certainly an objective here for some of the moves. I also had the idea, since we have this pawn formation that's sort of a reverse Carlsbad structure, I was thinking about trying the minority attack, getting my b pawn to b4 and attacking his 3 pawns here with my 2. And lots of times you can get a backward c pawn and have some weaknesses to play against. So I was working with that idea. And at this point, I spent a fair bit of time on this move, just trying to decide whether or not, how to continue. Part of me wanted to keep my bishop on this current diagonal in order to control this crucial square here on f5 even better. I have 2 pawns on it, but it's kind of clear that he might play g4 and f5 here at some point in the near future and continue his attack against me. On the other hand, as I said, I wanted to get my knight into d4, and so I figured if I went ahead and played this move, that this would basically, depending on his response, could allow me to play the knight into e4. So, for example, if he had played, I don't know, this a rook over to e1, I could play the knight into e4, and then it looks like he can win that pawn. He can win a pawn by exchanging, but he can't really, because that the pawn is off limits. It would be a bad mistake, because I could simply, discover an attack on the queen now with that bishop that I moved over here to b7, and he wouldn't be able to take back my knight because it's guarded by my other bishop. So he'd actually lose a piece in that transaction. So it was kind of a slender read, but it was what I was grasping at this point. I should remark, as I did here in the notes, that up till this point, Mike was just plunking down, up to this position right here. Mike was just making his moves within a second or two. And I was spending a lot of time. So I actually spent 40 minutes, which, if you think about it, is 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes per move. I was thinking for quite a while, and then it was just discouraging to make my move and then have him immediately respond. But he was playing this system, this Stonewall Attack, where he knew exactly where he wanted to put his pieces. I didn't know, but he knew, and he was just doing his setup. The disadvantage to doing something like that is, in order to play a system like that, you have to play in a way that doesn't interact with your opponent too much in the center. You have to be able to stay on your side of the board and develop the pieces the way you want. And so it's a little less ambitious in that regard for White to do that. He doesn't get the normal say-so in the center that he would, but he certainly gets to set up the pieces exactly the way that he's familiar with. So he played bishop to e1. As I said, I'll just go through a lot of these moves. There are reasons behind all of them. But I don't really have time to describe what all the thinking is. Actually, right here, I was a little surprised. I thought maybe this knight would play up to g5. Instead, he played a more of a consolidating move, I guess you'd call it. And that gave me the chance to drop my knight back, now preparing for f6. I wanted to play f6 and drive this knight out of the center. But he surprised me a little bit with queen g4. And now I'm a little reluctant to play s6, because if I did go ahead and do this, let's just see what my analysis is here. What I was worried about was that he'd just start sacking on g6. So knight takes, pawn takes back, and possibly the queen, if the queen took, I'd just push my f-pawn and break up the coordination between his queen and bishop. But I think the stronger way is to go ahead and take with the bishop, and then I could still play f5, but his queen could go to h4, and he has an attack that is a little better for black according to Stockfish, but it's more fun for white to play. And I didn't really want to defend this, so instead of going down this line after his queen g4, I went ahead and continued my idea of playing on the queen side with a minority attack of b4. And of course the idea here now is that he can't really afford to play cb because my knight could just take then on d4, and all of a sudden I've got real central domination. And plus my knight, that's a good post. It's working its way over to f5 here, where it can expel his or hold off his kingside attack. So he did not do that. Actually, he played a better move. After my b4, he played knight takes knight. I have to take back with the queen, and oh, actually, I should have. Yeah, he wouldn't have played c takes b4 before. I was missaying that. He would have traded the knight off first, and then in this position, played actually. Conceivably have gone ahead and taken the pawn, but instead of taking it back with my knight, I would have taken the d pawn at that point. So I took back his knight, and he had this other idea in mind, which was to play his knight to b3, coming after my queen, which is a better move. He's threatening now to come in here and fork my queen and bishop, although I'd be happy at this point to let him trade the knight for the bishop. So I exchanged on c3, thought he might take back with his bishop, but he took back with a pawn, which gives him this backward pawn, which is kind of what I was hoping for with the minority attack. And now I had visions of working my knight through, at some point here, after a little preparation, to a5 and into c4, into that weak square. So at this point, I was starting to feel like the tide was turning and black was starting to get his way. But I played queen to c8, which is probably not the most precise move. I should have played it to c7 instead, which is allows me to stay on the dark squares and threaten to go get along this not that diagonal, but the diagonal going to his king. So I didn't do that. I played to c8, and his knight came in as expected. And at this point, this is where I made a really bad mistake in the game. I made a blunder, and it's really frustrating because the same thing happened in the first round of this tournament when I lost to Mike Stevens. I'm sorry, Stephen Murray. It was the same sort of blunder. In almost the same position. I'll show you in a second. So he made this move, and immediately what my eye was attracted to was the possibility of knight takes pawn. And I'll show you a couple of those lines. But I can't actually do that. Well, okay, you can go back and look. Sorry, but if I the way this chess tool works, I would actually have to save this game and get out and look at the other game. I should have just put it in the clipboard. Would have been a good idea. Anyhow, what would have happened if I had done that is that, well, actually, I know what I can do. Let's try this. I'll pause. Okay, here was the game against Steve Murray after his 21st move. And I looked at the complications coming up from knight takes on d4 and looked at it for a long time and finally decided not to do it. But it turned out if I had analyzed it correctly that it was actually a good move and was not really a sacrifice if I had played it right. And I ended up losing that game, as you might remember, and I was mad at myself afterward for not going ahead and taking the initiative. Meanwhile, in my game, I have a very similar position where I'm looking at the knight on c6 taking on d4 and a seeming sacrifice, and I looked at it and boy, I can almost make it work. And I couldn't quite make it work. What I was looking at was that I would play knight takes d4, And the problem is that there are, a number of different variations springing out of this. But the main line that I was looking at, he obviously doesn't want to take back immediately. Pawn takes knight, because bishop takes check, and I win the knight straight away. So that would be bad. But what I was looking at was that he would take my bishop, and then I would take his knight. And the problem I ran into was that he could then, okay, so the idea now is if he takes my knight, I take with the bishop check, forking the king and the rook. Okay, but he has a little Zwischenzug here where he can play the rook to b1, attacking my queen. And even though I can, come here, possibly defending my knight, threatening to, now if he took it, pawn takes knight, I would take back with a queen check, and he interposes a bishop, say, and I win his loose bishop on d3. So that was a good variation. But the thing that breaks it here is that instead of him taking the knight at this point, he has another little Zwischenzug here. He can play bishop to f2, pinning the knight to my queen, and now he would win it on the next move. And I would get a few pawns, but he wins a pawn back at the end, and I'm down a piece. So I couldn't make this variation work. It turns out that it actually was a good move if I had analyzed it correctly. So back in this position, after knight takes b7, instead of taking his knight, the crucial move was to play to f5. And I think I looked at that because I remember seeing this possibility of a fork between the rook and the queen after knight f5. But this is pretty complicated because I'm down a piece, and it looks like he can take on f5, but I take back with the pawn, attacking his queen, and so on and so on. Anyhow, it all works out for me, but I couldn't figure it out. I spent wasted a lot of time thinking about it, and after about 20 minutes or so, I finally gave up and made a quick move that looked to me like it was just a safe alternative. And of course it was a blunder because he could just take that pawn. I undefended my pawn. And now all of a sudden, he's got a passed A pawn and a very strong position. His pieces are getting very active. So we'll zip through a few moves here because I've been taking a bit of time. And I took back. Hold on a second, I'll make sure I'm not paused. Okay, yeah, I'm not paused. That would be frustrating if I paused the video and didn't know that I wasn't recording the whole this time. So he pinned my knight to the rook. I want to step out of that pin. Otherwise, if it weren't for that, I could play this, still have this knight takes pawn idea on tap, but I can't do it with him pinning my rook. In fact, I think maybe it was this place where I was still looking at knight takes and then knight to f5 and decided that didn't work. And I have to be careful about where I put the rook. One possibility that I looked at for a while until I realized it was a very bad move was to attack that bishop, which is what I wanted to do. But the problem is, of course, is that I'm just walking into a fork. Be a bad mistake. So I didn't do that. Instead, I put it on the correct square, which was c8. And he's able to get his king off of that dangerous diagonal. And now my ideas don't work anymore, but I go ahead and try to force him through anyhow. I took back, forking the rook and the knight, but unfortunately now he can move his knight attacking my queen, and I can't really afford to take the rook. I mean, I could take the rook, he takes my queen, and I take the knight back, so it's a queen for a rook and a knight exchange. But the problem is that I'm already down in material. I'm already down a piece going into that, so I can't make that exchange. So instead I move my queen, and now there's a little bit of dancing around with pieces. He develops, I'd like to try to get pressure on the A pawn, but that never really happened. After a while I decided that I just had to get this bishop into the game, even if it meant allowing him to exchange it. At least it would activate my rooks. he didn't do that. He just supported it, which is probably a good move. And I just had to make a move. He came back and defended some more. I dropped my bishop back. And I should say, this is the point, this is the last move that I recorded in my scorebook. And from here on to the end of the game, which is a whole lot of moves, close to 40 more moves, Mike Meehan recorded for me. And my situation's dire. I have about 4 minutes left. He has 34 minutes. And Mike Meehan has 34 minutes. And Stockfish, he evaluates this as nearly 5 points in favor of white. So, I'm just dead lost. But you just have to keep playing and do your best. I couldn't afford to lose. So he activated another piece, which is a good move. I had to move my rook to a reasonable square. He got his knight off of the rim and with tempo. And I moved my queen. And then he played it back, which was a little curious. I expected him to continue centralizing his knight, going, in this position, maybe playing back to d3, for example, something like that. But he came back to a6, so I repeated. At this point, I would be thrilled by a draw, even though I'd lose rating points, but it would be much better than losing, which is the alternative, really. It's a one-result game at this point, honestly. So he didn't accept the draw. He piled up on the c file. And I went ahead and hoped that I could maybe generate some tactics with an exchange here. He took back with the pawn. I think taking back with the queen would have been stronger. And now I decided I just had to play energetically. So I started pushing my pawns in the center to try to to open up some lines and just allow some tactics to flow while his pieces are a little awkwardly placed here on the queen side. He blockaded with his queen. And I played e5. Now, Stockfish doesn't like this move, probably because it, will open up after pawn takes pawn, that opens up the f file for an attack by white. But I had to open up lines for my rook and bishop. And so for me, in this situation of the game, playing with energy is about the only thing that I can do. And so I went ahead and played e5. I think in the circumstances, it was a good move for me. I played rook takes, and now he made a mistake. He took my, first he traded the rooks off, that's fine. But then he took my d pawn. And the mistake is that, the problem is it looks like he's having a hard time finding a move here. I'm threatening the knight. The knight can't really come out through c5 because I have my rook and queen both on it. I can, get 2 pieces for my rook if he does that. But he has kind of a slick move just with b6, pushing that past pawn, and it's going to be very fast, getting on its way to promote. And of course, the beauty of this move is that it doesn't quite do it that way, but the queen defends the knight if he had moved his pawn. He didn't see that though. He took my d pawn with his queen, which allows me to capture the b pawn with a discovered attack on the queen. Queen has to go somewhere, and now has to worry about this knight. And so he went to gain, made a move with tempo here, playing queen to f4, threatening to play queen takes f7 check, which looks like a very serious threat, and it is. But I figured this was a real blunder. In the game, I got all excited because I'm just able to play rook f5, and now it looks like I'm, how does he save his rook? He moves his queen somewhere, and then I'm going to threaten to win that rook if he doesn't defend it. And what he did was to drop his queen back, which is actually a mistake. It turns out that there's a very slick move, which I did not see until I actually was analyzing the game with Stockfish afterward, which is to play his rook over to c1. So leave his queen under attack, but my queen's under attack too with check. That's the key thing, because I thought, I didn't see this because I figured he couldn't leave the back rank because of the checkmate that I would have. But of course, the problem is his move comes with check, so I never have time to actually make the checkmating move here. Okay, fortunately for me, he did not do that. He dropped his queen back, and that allowed me to take his knight. And the beauty of it, of course, is that my queen is controlling this c8 square. I was willing to have him play rook takes rook, doubling my pawns at this point. That was fine with me. I'm up a pawn, and it would simplify the game. I figured, at worst I would get a draw out of that. But he didn't do that. He played his rook over to d1, and that allowed me to just go ahead and sort of consolidate. I made actually what I think is a good move here, bishop to f6, and it was slick because it controls this d8 entry square for his rook, so it keeps his rook from coming down and checking, because that was the threat. But it also, it stops that move, but it also allows this move for me when I do get checked. And this is quite a strong formation I've found with fianchettoed bishops in an endgame. If you park your king on g7, have the pawns around it, and the king's protecting the bishop on f6. It doesn't always work, but there are many positions in which it works well. And it worked well here. So he made a bad mistake in response to this, but he really, it's sort of tough for him because in this position right here, my rook and queen are both, I'm sorry, I'm getting a few too many arrows. Maybe if I subtract those arrows first. My rook and, let's see, rook and queen are both attacking f1. And so if either of his major pieces come off of the back rank, I can just play, rook or queen down check, and will lead to checkmate in 2 moves. So he has to be careful about that. So he's really constrained here. And, if he tries, probably his best move would have been to play h4 or something, but my bishop can guard the h2 square. So he has a little trouble unwinding here. What he chose to do was a disaster, though. King to g1, because there's simply a check. And, that was a funny mistake to make, because at this point, as I say in my notes there, he had 16 minutes on his clock. I was down with less than a minute and a half on my clock, and he was trying to rush me a bit, but he really should take a little more time, I think. So I was able to check, and king has to go back, and I win his bishop. And now he can come down and check me, but my king can come up into that pocket, and I'm fine. He doesn't, before this wouldn't have worked, because when he still had the bishop where my queen is, then this f8 square would have been very bad for me if his queen could come into it. But now that I've taken his bishop, he no longer has the control over this f8 square. So he dropped back with the queen to try to defend his back rank. I played to b5 to reassert that threat of a checkmate on f1 if he moves off of it. He came back with this king to help control that square, and that allowed me to force a trade of queens. And I'll go through real quick. I mean, these are very fast moves, at least on my part, in the end of the game. And it was really just a question of trying to trade off rooks. Of course, not lose a piece in the meantime, but activate my king. Well, actually, that was... You may wonder why I didn't just play rook takes pawn here. That would have been a good move, but playing fast, I didn't see it. I was just trying to restrict the movement of his king. And then I did go back and attack it, and he checked me and got it out of harm's way. I was able to check him, and now, let's see, rook over here would have forced a trade of rooks, but I didn't see that. Instead, I went for trying to check him along the rank. I checked him. He probably should have come up to the 5th rank. Instead, he went back, which then allowed me to actually trade the rooks. And now it's a really easy win. All I have to do is make use of the fact that I don't trade pawns off, and I can tempo with my king, with my bishop, because I have that extra piece, and I can force his king back and away from the pawn. So, at this point, he resigned, because what's going to happen is my bishop will come to this diagonal. And boy, I'm having trouble with my arrows today. This dark diagonal, and keep keep him out of that square, and he'll get pushed away from the defense of the C pawn, or his H pawn rather, and I'll go over and win it and win with my passed pawn. So that was a real come from behind victory. I really should have lost. It's a little too bad for Mike. He worked hard and in some sense deserved to win in that game. But sometimes you just got to scrabble as hard as you can and try to keep from losing. And that's how I was able to do it. So, well, thanks. It's been long, especially the astronomy segment this week. But if you're still here looking at chess, thank you for being a faithful and loyal fan, and like it if you did. And I'll see you next week from my week at the club. Bye-bye.